You know, we've been debating climate change and whether or not there's an actual global emergency for quite some time now. What are the actual facts and what is fiction? Joining us today from Comox, BC to talk about it is Dr. Patrick Moore. He's a doctorate in ecology and is one of the co-founders of Greenpeace. He has since left the organization, is now director of the CO2 Coalition and author of the book, Fake, Invisible Catastrophes and Threats of Doom. Dr. Moore, welcome to Bridge City News.
Nice to be on with you, Hal.
Thank you so much. So first of all, what made you decide to leave Greenpeace, even though you were one of the co-founders?
Well, I left it after 15 years in the top committee. I was on the first voyage against U.S. hydrogen bomb testing in Alaska, which we won against the world's most powerful organization, the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission. And then we went after the French atmospheric nuclear testing in the South Pacific 2 years in a row, and we got them to stop testing nuclear weapons in the atmosphere. Then we switched completely. Paul Spong, a whale scientist, came to us and said they're killing 30,000 big whales every year in the middle of the Pacific, and you guys are the only ones who know how to go out in boats. Because we had sailed across the North Pacific to the Aleutians in the case of Alaska, and we sailed from New Zealand to the French Polynesia, 2,500 miles,
Wow.
2 years in a row. Mm-hmm. And so we said, yes, that is a very good idea. And a lot of the people in Greenpeace at the time said, whales? What are you talking about? We have to save the world from nuclear war. But we thought we'd already done our bit, some of us. And we also, instead of handing out death and doom and gloom on one hand, we decided to let out the beauty of nature and to go for nature, because that's the green in Greenpeace. The peace is, of course, not ending up in a nuclear war. And so we went out on the ocean 4 years in a row against the Japanese and Russian whaling fleets and eventually stopped it altogether by lobbying at the International Whaling Commission. And so we won that too. And there's very few big whales being killed in the world today. And then we went after the 250,000 baby seals being clubbed while still nursing at their mother's breasts off the coast of Canada. That wasn't very popular in Canada because they saw it as some kind of national pride. I don't know why, because we would never do that with land animals, with mammals like bears. We wouldn't let them murder all the young while they're still nursing. And so we won that one too, eventually. It took 5 years. And then we switched our campaigns to pollution, toxic waste being dumped in various places. And at that time, the United States and Canada had already adopted pretty good water and air pollution rules, but Europe had not. And we had a lot of countries in Greenpeace in Europe, France, Germany, Britain, Netherlands, and others. And so we focused on the rivers of Europe, which were basically rendered dead by factories putting their waste through pipes underwater in the rivers. And this was true of the Thames as well as the Rhine and the Elbe and many other big rivers in Europe. And we had the riverboat go up with divers, go down and plug the pipes. And then the waste would back up into the factory. And the media thought that was pretty funny. And also it got us attention. And that was what we knew how to do, was to get attention. Today, these guys are like a bunch of college kids on a summer cruise. They don't even come out of their offices to talk to anybody anymore. And they're all with the World Economic Forum and the United Nations and all this net zero crap. And that isn't why I left them. I'll go back a little bit. They've degenerated far further than when I left them. When I left them, they were starting to call humans the enemies of the earth, the enemies of nature, as if we were the only bad species on the planet, which is a bit too much like original sin for me. I'm not a fundamentalist in that sort of sense. And so I had to leave because of that. But I didn't leave at first because I was so dedicated to the movement. But then my fellow directors, I was one of 5 international directors from 79 when we created Greenpeace International to 85 when this happened. They decided, none of them having any formal science education, they decided we should have a campaign to ban chlorine worldwide. Now, it is true that as an element, chlorine is dangerous material. It was used as a weapon by the Germans in the First World War, chlorine gas. But I said, you got to be a little more nuanced about this, you guys, because table salt is sodium chloride, and it is an essential nutrient for all life. And in addition to that, adding chlorine to drinking water was the biggest advance in the history of public health to prevent water communicable diseases like cholera. And thirdly, 85% of our pharmaceuticals are made with chlorine chemistry, and 25% of them have chlorine in them. So come on, guys. If you want to ban something that's chlorine, fine, like DDT, that had already been banned. It's a chlorinated hydrocarbon. But they didn't know their chemistry and they didn't know their toxicology, and I couldn't teach it to them. They just wanted to do this campaign because it would make lots of money.
So Patrick, do you believe that the planet is actually seeing a climate emergency, which we see so much in the mainstream media right now? And if not, why?
Well, the first thing is to see is there isn't an emergency now of the climate. There are weather emergencies, tornadoes and hurricanes, floods, droughts. That is weather. The climate is the average weather. And the average weather shows no increase in hurricanes, no increase in droughts, no increase in floods. The sea is rising 2 millimeters a year in places where there were no glaciers during the most recent glaciation. Where I live, the sea is receding because the land is rebounding from the glaciers having melted faster than the water is rising. And those are tide table figures. So, and not only that, 2 millimeters a year, you're not going to have to run in order to escape the sea. And if you're really that worried, hire the Dutch, because they have 25% of their land below sea level, producing more food than any other country in Europe. So there are solutions to all these issues. And the solution for extreme weather is to harden our infrastructure so that it doesn't get knocked down by high winds, to control floodplains, like the floods in New Orleans were because they didn't put proper ditching and waterways in there to take care of that, or don't build your towns where it floods. And as far as droughts go, they've been happening since the beginning of time. They come in cycles. There was one that lasted for 200 years in the US Southwest, which is why the Anasazi people, the cliff dwellers, disappeared, because there was not enough water for them to grow food for themselves, and they never came back. And so that was 1,000 years ago. So yes, the climate has been changing over the many, many millions of years. But since 1600, which was the peak of the Little Ice Age, when it was really nasty, the River Thames was froze freezing over year after year back then. The last time it froze over was 1814. Before we were even using any significant amount of fossil fuels. The world started warming again in 1600, coming out of the Little Ice Age to today, over 400 years, more than 400 years, the temperature has risen by 1.1 degrees Celsius as best we can measure. But one of the big problems and the big controversy right now is what's called the urban heat island effect. Urban landscapes are only about 2 to 3% of the Earth's area. That is where almost all the weather stations are. There are some in urban areas, but they're just being counted in with all the urban weather stations. And there is no doubt that cities make it warmer in the city because of the concrete and the heating that's going on there in the buildings. So the winter temperature in a big city is much warmer at a weather station that's in the airport or the middle of the city than it would be if that city wasn't there.
You know, we keep hearing over and over again that CO2 is causing global warming and climate change. And I understand that you believe that there is no long-term evidence that CO2 is causing increased global temperatures. Can you explain?
CO2 is a greenhouse gas, but it is an extremely minor one. And therefore, there are many other factors, including the sun and water vapor and the clouds, which can completely override its effect for hundreds or even millions of years. If you look back at the record of global temperature for the last 500 million years, how do we know that? by marine sediment cores. Drill down into the bottom of the sea, and you can find proxies for the temperature and the CO2 and all kinds of other factors. It's amazing what science has been able to do. So we know for sure that CO2 has been out of sync with temperature more often than in sync with temperature over the last 500 million years. And even if you look at the last 400 years, 450 actually, back to about 1550, when they first invented thermometers, which would accurately tell you what the temperature was. Before that, you just have to say it's quite cold or just nice or quite hot. They had nothing to measure temperature with before then. So since then, in central England, there has been a continuous measurement in a number of meteorological sites of the CO2 and the temperature. Sorry, not of the CO2, of the temperature, because there wasn't any increase in CO2 until about 1850, starting in 1550. The graph shows very clearly that there has been no increase in the rate of warming over the last 400 years, even though around 1900, CO2 started to go up in an exponential curve and just completely outstrip any change in temperature. So in other words, an exponential increase in CO2, a doubling almost, has not caused any change in the rate of temperature since 1600. And from 1600 to about 1850, 1900, there was no significant CO2 emissions.
Wow. Now, our federal government is on a campaign to achieve net zero carbon emissions over the next 10 to 15 years. Much of the plan focuses on wind and solar power, wind and solar energy. What are your thoughts on green energy sources right now, Patrick? Can we really count on them? Are they reliable?
The first point is green is a color. It is not a scientific term. Leaves are green and then they turn brown.
Yeah.
So when you call wind and solar green, what part of it is green? The wind, okay, let's call the wind green. Let's call the sun green.
Sure.
But the windmills and the solar panels are not green. They are made from minerals like everything else is, like nuclear plants are made from, like gas plants are made from. And they don't last anywhere near as long as the other major producers of electricity. They got a 20-year lifespan at best. They're having a heck of a time with windmills breaking down and having to be replaced. The blades are failing. And you know what they do with these huge fiberglass blades cannot be recycled. They bury them. They cut them up and bury them so no one will see them. It is insane to call wind and solar green. Green, okay, let's call agriculture green because it produces food and life, right? If you want to say green has to do with life. But green has nothing to do with machines.
What are your thoughts on nuclear energy, though? A lot of people are quite concerned about nuclear energy, but a lot of people feel it's better for the environment. What are your thoughts?
Well, it's better for the environment if you're worried about CO2 emissions. It's also better for the economy if you're worried about running out of fossil fuels someday. We could replace 50% of our fossil fuels with nuclear energy in about 40 to 50 years if we really went at it. Because nuclear energy can be used for anything that requires electricity or heat. And that is a lot of the energy. Whereas airplanes and trucks, you can't put a wire on them, right? And so nuclear has to be used mainly with things that are stable, except all large ships could be nuclear powered. Russia has 6 nuclear icebreakers, and 6 countries have nuclear navies with submarines that go underground with 100 nuclear missiles, underwater, for months with 100 nuclear missiles on them.
Wow.
If we can do that, we can run our whole fleet of tankers and cargo ships with nuclear power too. It's not very difficult to run a nuclear reactor. It was pretty hard to invent one. It took a while to figure out how to do that. But once you've got a nuclear reactor, it's no harder than running a steam plant. You know, it isn't. It's just technical. But let me make this comparison. 1.6 million people die in road accidents every year in the world. This includes pedestrians, but they were road accidents because of moving objects. Not one person has died in North America in the 60 years that nuclear plants have been running here. over 100 of them. The only nuclear accident that caused death was Chernobyl, because they made a stupid mistake and let the thing blow up. And it's the only class of reactor that was capable of blowing up after making a stupid mistake. Fukushima killed no one. 20,000 people were killed by the tsunami. And in the middle of the situation, CNN put a headline up on the TV saying, "Nuclear crisis deepens as bodies wash ashore." That was their headline. You can't find that anywhere on the internet anymore. They probably know what a horribly stupid and nasty thing that was to do with 20,000 people dying from a tsunami that had nothing to do with the reactor.
Dr. Patrick Moore is the director of CO2 Coalition and is as well author of Fake Invisible Catastrophes and the Threats of Doom. Dr. Patrick Moore, thanks so much for joining us today from Comox, British Columbia.
Thank you very much, Al.